Well, welcome everybody to the panel discussion. This is sort of the before lunch, but it's the final organized staged event, I guess you'd say, for the conference. My name is Ron Rutowski. I'm from Arizona State University, emeritus faculty member there, but still engaged in biology in a number of ways, including editorial activities with journals and butterfly counts and other ongoing research projects. My background is in behavioral ecology. My research program it deals with bright coloration in animals, in particular the mechanisms that are involved in production of the bright coloration, as well as their function of bright coloration and its evolution and its perception. We've done a lot of work on butterfly vision. I confess I've done very, very little work with monarchs. I did do one project some years ago that never got published with an undergraduate on monarch coloration, viceroy coloration, and queen coloration, and how those interacted over the geographic range of the viceroy. So I guess I was invited here as sort of a disinterested party. Although I will say that I work with Gail a lot on the Southwest Monarch Studies. I'm on the board of that. So I just wanted you to know that that's my perspective. That's where I'm coming from. The panel today is, well, first of all, let me say something about the questions. So there was a box back there where you were all welcome to write down questions and stick them in the box. There were a lot of monarch butterflies in the box too, plastic ones. But we ended up getting a total of 28 questions. And Jessica Griffiths and Gail Morris and I went through them to try and winnow out the ones that might not be so great for a discussion with like a panel like this. And so there were some that just asked for straight factual information. One of them, there was an interesting question about, are there monarchs in Baja? And so we tried to sort of steer away from questions that had a simple yes/no answer, or just a single piece of information, and tried to come up with questions that were more open-ended, and not questions that necessarily have a clear answer at all. So I'm relying on the panel to take off with some of these questions. I think they're really, they can be really interesting. We did reword some of them, so you might not hear the exact wording that was on the card, but tried to adapt them a bit to this situation. The panel, of course, is Myron Zalucki from Australia, Chip Taylor from Kansas, David James from Washington State, Mia Monroe, right? Yeah. I'm with Xerxes.
I'm a volunteer with Xerxes and I'm in California.
Yeah, okay. And then Kingston, Leong, who I'm very happy to meet and see. We've never actually met from an emeritus faculty member like me, but from Cal Poly. So the way this is going to go is that I'll pose questions. I have probably a half dozen or more. Just as a guideline, the idea would be that you're all welcome to respond to every one of the questions. Try to keep your responses focused, and I was thinking we would maybe shoot for each individual would have a maximum of 3 minutes to address the question. And Jessica and Gail will be keeping us tuned in on that. But I do sort of hope, I have to say, that the discussion might get a little more freewheeling than that, and not be constrained to just, to reflect and bounce ideas off one another. So we'll see. If that gets out of control, I'll exercise my prerogative and ask Chip to leave the room. So is there some, and I did want to say that Gail asked me to say, and this is something we talked about, both Gail and Jessica and I, that we do right now plan to take the questions and transcribe them into a document and provide answers. We haven't quite sorted out exactly how it's going to happen, but I envisage a single document with all of the questions on there, and with answers to them for those people who asked them. it's possible that this document, I think, could get posted on the Western Monarch Advocates website. It might be an interesting post-conference thing to do. So keep an eye out for that, and maybe there may be some news forthcoming about when, if and when that, I mean, it's not if so much, it's when that will happen. We'll see. We'll see what the details are. Okay. Sorry, I'm not going to ask if there are any questions. I've got a question. Force a habit with students, you know. Are there any questions? All clear? Sound makes sense? Okay. Let me just get this going here. Hang on a second. I didn't bring a printer with me, so I had to put it on my iPad. So I'm going to ask a very softball question for starters. I mean, for somebody who wasn't at this conference previously, you know, it's just stunning, especially the amount of scientific work and also the amount of management work and other work that people are doing. I mean, last night was a real case in point, the number of tables with different projects. And what's so stunning, and what's of course is very striking, is that so much effort is being made on the behalf of monarchs, this single species of butterfly. And so one of the questions I'd like to ask the panels and get each one to sort of reflect on this is, what is it about monarchs that causes so many people to work so hard for them, about them in particular? I mean, I've worked with a lot of different butterflies, but this is so focused, relatively speaking. So we'll start with Myron.
So why I work on them or why people work on them?
Well, what are your thoughts about why people work on
But just a nice butterfly. That's it.
Kick me off.
It's more than just a butterfly.
Oh,
right?
thank goodness sakes. It is a butterfly.
It's charismatic. It's charismatic.
There are many charismatic species out
Oh,
there, mate.
yes, but this is a charismatic species like no other insect. I mean, people, it's hard to explain. How do you explain charisma? I can't explain charisma.
Some people have it, some don't.
Well, that isn't an explanation. All right, but monarchs have charisma. Somehow people are attached to them. My perception of this is that this is an insect you can connect with. How many insects can you connect with? Can you connect with ants? Can you connect with a moth? Can you connect with a beetle? You can connect with this butterfly because it's slow moving, it's beautiful, it has a very interesting larva, very interesting annual cycle. And you know, there's something about it when you bring that caterpillar in when you're a kid that attaches you to a bigger phenomena that you can't get from any other insect.
I beg to differ.
Well, good.
I agree with Chip as well. It's an icon, it's an iconic insect. I mean,
It's a bloody
if you look-
iconic insect.
it is throughout the world. I mean, even in Australia, you know, you look at a children's book and the butterfly featured is the monarch butterfly, even in countries where monarch butterflies do not occur. So there's something in our human psyche that just gravitates towards the monarch. It is, as Chip said, it's hard to explain. What do you think, man?
So I can give you many examples of charismatic butterflies that are just as good as monarchs and deserve attention.
All butterflies are good.
Thank you.
I agree with the two gentlemen to my right that monarchs are also widespread, so there's a chance for almost all of us to have encountered monarchs at some point. But I'd also like to give a nod to the efforts early on to involve all of us in working on solving the mysteries. I represent the community science part of this group here. And since those early tagging efforts of Urquhart, since the early efforts of the people on the West Coast, such as Kingston, we've all been involved in some way. And to me, that's another thing that captures us, is there's a way for all of us to contribute to learning. And we've all gone through several generations of people who've helped with that understanding. So I think that's another thing, is widespread, and there's a long tradition of all of us being involved.
It's interesting, but I think the answer is, if you go to any grade school and ask them the name of butterfly, guess what? it's the monarch. So it's the most visible, and I think it's a means in which it will expand to other areas of conservation. It's a good start. And so that's how I feel. It's a wonderful butterfly to study, but anyway, I like all insects because I'm entomology. And the one I want to see is the weta. Have you know what is a weta? It's
The weta?
Yeah, the weta. I want to meet one. It's a huge thing. So.
Yeah, I mean, what about the overwintering aggregations? To what extent do you think those factor into people's attraction and interest in the monarch butterfly?
And I would say that's probably one of the main reasons why you are interested, actually. I hesitate to say this because I'll be beaten up, but there's a bunch of other Danaeans that do exactly the same thing. There's a thing called the blue tiger, which is equally as pretty if you look it up. Tiramala hamata and the other Tiramala species. They form overwintering aggregations, but they're not as large or as specky, to use an Australian idiom, spectacular. The monarch overwintering sites are spectacular when they occur, and there's no question about that, and I think that's probably one of the main reasons. Anyway.
You've got to get there. It's a spiritual experience. You walk into those forests in Mexico, in which you have these, I call them bags, columns, tree trunks, whole trees covered with monarch butterflies. And you contemplate the fact that most of those butterflies have come from 1,500 miles, 2,000 miles, 2,500 miles to get there. And the most emotional experience I've ever had with monarch butterflies was going there on the 17th of November in 1997. And I went there with 2 Canadians, and we were collaborating at that particular time. And we were looking up at these clusters that were forming. And it was magnificent. The butterflies were coming in and forming clusters for the first time. And then I heard this little tinkle, tinkle, tinkle in front of me. And then I looked over here, and there's another little tinkle, tinkle. And I started brushing away at the vegetation. And there were butterflies dying, missing a wing, missing even an abdomen, but they're still tinkling. And there were butterflies dying within days of having arrived at the overwintering sites. They fly all of that distance with every ounce or every milligram of energy that they've got to get there, only to die. And for me, that is really a demonstration of the incredible power there is in nature to reproduce. You do everything that you can to continue your genotype and genealogy. And you see that very seldom. You see that as well demonstrated in nature as you do with monarch butterflies. For me, that was, as a biologist, that was a singular event, a very emotional one.
And you don't even have to go to Mexico for an emotional event with monarch butterflies, because yesterday afternoon I took a few people to a site in the area that some people had never seen before, some people in this room had never seen, and it literally brought them to tears. And this was 15,000 butterflies, not 15 million, and it still produced an emotional experience. But not many people get to experience that, so I'm not sure I agree with Myron, or however you pronounce your name, that's a major reason why it's an iconic butterfly. A lot of people I know, in Washington State and other places too, conflate the two words, butterfly and monarch. For some reason, a butterfly to them is a monarch, even when it's not a monarch. And I don't know where and how that originates, but maybe from school and books and media. And it just gets into our soul. I'm going back to the last question. So, Mia.
I believe profoundly in having an intimate experience with nature, and so when people visit an overwintering grove, they're visiting a phenomena, they're surrounded by another species, They feel like they're connected to something bigger. You all know the feeling, you have experienced it, but we want that for everybody. And that's another thing that's amazing in California is there's overwintering sites that can become a dream for almost everyone in California to visit and have that experience that is so moving and that inspires one to kind of rethink one's place in the universe, or to try to do work to protect and make sure it happens. And so I'm kind of all really about making sure everyone can have that experience, which is really that intimate connection with something beyond us. And that's why I think the overwintering sites are so moving, so powerful, such a draw, something you'll never forget, something you'll work for.
Well, my experience is basically limited to California. Although we have a smaller number of butterflies, the awe factor is still there. The reason why I say that, the first time I ever been to the winter site is I think they had gone out and were sunning. The sun was hitting against the butterfly, and it seemed like a beautiful mosaic of, I mean, it is amazingly pretty. And I would like to make another statement about the California butterflies. I think it's a national treasure within the U.S. It's the only one in the U.S. that really supports overwintering butterflies. So we're very, very fortunate to have butterflies in this area and be able to see it. Not at the great grandeur as you see it in Mexico, but still, even a small amount of clusters, even a few thousand, is amazing to see. And I have yet to bring anyone into a grove that did not feel the same way. And when they consider Mexico as being several million in one given area, they can't even imagine that.
I'd like to add one more thing, and that is the power of symbolism. I was at the Presidio of San Francisco, and it's an overwintering site that Stu has helped revitalize. And the event for hundreds of children was on the beauty of migration. Because many people are on the move these days. Many people have to leave their homes, make big journeys that are often perilous to a future that they hope is a little better. And that really got me thinking about all the other aspects of symbolism for monarchs. We see a monarch flying free. We see the beauty of nature. We get insights into the many mysteries. We've all spent a couple of days identifying the things we don't really know. But also for many people, monarchs represent hope, a world without borders, a chance for a future refuge. And I just want to offer that as another very important value of monarchs, the symbolism that they offer us.
That's very good. And in the interest of putting something to rest, I do have a soul, contrary to my colleague on the side. I'd already fallen in love with monarchs when I did my PhD, but in 1991 I went to Gainesville, Florida, and Lincoln Brower, and it took me down to Mexico. So we're in the Sierra Cinque Mountains, it's middle of winter, the colonies have formed. We're walking down this arroyo, and the first thing I noticed was I'm walking on a carpet of dead butterfly wings. And sort of, this is odd. Then you hear, and I think it was Nabokov, the susurrant sound of wings. And so literally they're sitting there rubbing their wings together, and it's audible, you can hear it. And then you look up and go, my goodness. And you know, kids these days, it's awesome, it's awesome, it's awesome, it's awesome. If everything is awesome, nothing is awesome. But this was truly awe-inspiring.
Oh, snap. So I wanted to take this in a different, somewhat different direction now. I mean, we're talking about all the effort that we've seen that people made, and there's sort of two camps, if you will, in terms of the kinds of efforts that are being made. Again, we've heard talks like Mika's and Chip's today, and Kingston's, the scientific work. And then we last night saw a tremendous amount of work that's being done in terms of management of habitats, management of monarch migrations. And it presents a dilemma in a way, because the hallmark of the scientific work, as we especially heard in Chip's talk today, is how much we don't know, the uncertainty, the tentativeness of the conclusions. And yet, last night, there were people at these tables who were all engaged in things right now, trying to do the best they can for monarchs. And it presents a sort of tension or dichotomy. How are the managers supposed to deal with the tentativeness and the uncertainty that's surrounding the scientific information that we have available? And how are the scientists supposed to deal with having their work maybe overblown or mistaken or something like that? And I was wondering if you guys could comment on that issue and how you deal with it. Can we start with Kingston? Let's move it the other way first.
Well, I've been playing with habitat management for some years. And what I found out was that this is a type of project that you start and never see fruition. In other words, you identify a problem, you try to correct the problem by planting trees. The trees take time to grow, and it takes about 15, 20 years. I may not be around. But basically, if I give you the foundation, someone else can come over and tweak it and make it a lot better. Management is a long-term thing, and so is this Monarch Butterfly project. So it is important that we start now. When you identify a problem, work on it. Because in Monroe, where we lost about close to 5,000 trees due to pine pitch canker, we planted cypress trees in certain areas to block the winds, and we had little grade school kids coming in and help plant it. And the reason why we do that is it's kind of interesting, when they go out and plant something, they always ask about their tree. And so they are the future. So if you can start with them, and then it'll take about 20 years. I will not be around in 20 years, I guarantee you that. And so it's up to people like Jessica to come along and tweak it a lot better.
Okay, everybody who's a Western Monarch Thanksgiving count monitor, please raise your hands. Be proud. You are contributing to community science. You get out there and follow rigorous protocol. You're part of one of the longer standing data sets. It's not the whole picture. It doesn't offer the solutions. It's just an important data set. And as we get access to more and more private lands, as we learn that there is more to contribute, such as many of you going out and now noting arrival, cluster formation, onset of mating, we'll all be part of that team building the data that Chip helped us lay out is still so much needed. But thank you. I just want to acknowledge that that's one thing that I've watched in my nearly 30 years is the growth of community science. Of course, a lot of us do it through INAT now, but we all contribute, Western Monarch Mystery Count, the whole role that each of us can play as community scientists following protocol to contribute to the bigger research questions. So that's just one of the things I want to share in response to that.
Yeah, we certainly do lack a lot of data, as Chip pointed out, but we do know fundamentals, and we're working on those, like Myron was talking with the overwintering count, and we know that the spring migration or the exodus from the clusters means that we need milkweed available. So work's being done on spring milkweed. So there are fundamentals like that that we know that will help, and growing milkweed, wherever and whenever is also pretty much important as well. So hopefully the data situation will improve I can't say very quickly, but we do have some new people, Mika and others that will be working on monarchs in the future. So hopefully, over the next decade, we'll accumulate a lot more data to answer a lot of the questions we need to answer.
Yeah, this is Chip again. Well, we started Monarch Watch in 1992, and we started it as an educational organization and with some bow to conservation and research, of course. But we spent most of our time on research and education. Then I got an email in 2004. And this was where you come into conflict with doing the science and the education and actually doing something that makes a difference in another's respect, in the respect that we're all talking about here. I got this email from a farmer in Nebraska in the summer of 2004. And he said, you know what, I've adopted these genetically modified crops, corn and soybeans, and I'm eliminating the milkweeds in my row crops because they're a low-level weedy contaminant in those fields. And you know what? I'm eliminating monarch butterflies by eliminating the milkweeds. And then I looked at the whole thing that I knew about monarchs and milkweeds and row crops, and I think, oh my gosh, there's hundreds, 200 million acres of row crops with milkweeds growing in a large proportion of them. What this is going to mean is that monarchs are going to go down. The population is going to take a dive. I've got to do something about it. And Monarch Watch was barely surviving from year to year at that time. They said, we've got to convert to get into real conservation. So that's when I started the Monarch Way Station program as a result of that email. And that's when I started lobbying for conservation. And our efforts now have morphed into working with 5 nurseries around the country to produce milkweed plugs that are regionally appropriate to get in the ground to account for a lot of the habitat loss that's taken place. So we've gone from monarch way stations to rural restoration. And we've distributed over 1 million milkweed plugs. But that is not enough. We are told that we have to restore about 1 billion stems out there. So the task is really big, and what you are all doing and how you're directing your efforts is extremely important because our task is really large. We may be losing as many as 2 million acres a year to development and other changes in habitat use or land use. And the question I always have for people engaged in all of this who are beating their chests about how much has to be done, I said, are you going to do something that is sufficient to compensate for the habitat we're losing? The answer is that nobody knows. We don't know what we're losing. We don't even know what we're replacing. So we've got to dig, we've got to move in those directions as much as we possibly can. We have to understand what we're doing. And we have to understand how effective it is, because that's the way to really move forward.
Sure, I can add a great deal to this other than you need more data, and everybody says that, but I think there needs to be a better interaction between your scientists and the citizen scientists to get what is required. And there's probably an ego problem to overcome with the scientists, some of them. I'll say no more about that. And so it's an opportunity to harness what is out there to build a bigger picture so you can be part of it, basically. So the Monarch should create a United States of America and a United North America because it doesn't care about your politics. And if you can do that sharing, you'll go a long, long way. I'll make one little plea. When you collect data, absence data is just as important as presence data. And it'd be good to record that.
Great, thanks for those thoughtful comments. Myron, you brought up politics, so maybe we could move into that a little bit. As we all know, a petition has been filed with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to list the monarch as an endangered species. And action on this position has been postponed at this point. But still, what I'm not asking necessarily where you stand on it, but what are the pros and cons of listing the monarch in the Endangered Species Act?
Well, you can see some of that in California where you need a permit to pick up a dead monarch off a bloody grill. I mean, for goodness sakes, that's ridiculous. I've never heard anything more stupid in my life. I'm going home, so I don't have to suffer this. So getting a species listed triggers a whole bunch of responses in Australia as well. Some of them very good, obviously. Some of them it's like, you cannot collect the butterfly or whatever it is, and suddenly amateur butterfly collectors will not share their data unless it's revealed that they have one and all that sort of rubbish. It's personally, I don't think it's listable. That's a personal opinion. And that's for all sorts of reasons. But what that has done is galvanize people to think about the problem. As a species, it's not going to go extinct. And the phenomenon has reduced, but who knows? And we can have an argument about this, I love arguments. It may be going back to levels that are normal, whatever normal is. But you may well lose that very spectacular sight that is truly awesome. But even the small ones you have here are awe-inspiring. All right? Extinction is, to get down to extinction with an insect, not easy. They're different to mammals, and often the criteria used to list is based on vertebrates. So it's a different kettle of fish. So you need to think about that very carefully.
Yeah, this is a complicated issue. I don't see anything positive coming out of listing. In fact, I think one of the things that you run into when you hear about people who are advocating for listing is that they think that listing is going to release money for conservation. But listing is also going to be associated with regulation. And I can tell you that having lived in rural Kansas, having dealt with a lot of farmers, having dealt with a lot of people who have landscapes that have milkweed on them, that nobody wants to see regulation. They fear regulation, they absolutely fear it. And so the real danger here is that causing monarchs to be listed could result in a real backfire, with people actually pulling out and killing milkweed and killing it in wholesale because they don't want to be inspected, they don't want to have their property inspected, what have you. So there's a whole bunch of other things that could be really negative coming out of this. And I don't see the necessity for it with respect to the population dynamics that I'm familiar with. Yes, the population goes up and down due to weather events, but if we look at the history of monarchs, they were probably even lower in the dirty 30s. You go back to the Ice Age, Little Ice Age, the 1300 to 1850, they were probably even lower then because it was a heck of a lot colder. And cold as well as heat could drive these populations down. So, we don't have a good grip on the populations of the species over time. We don't have an idea of how this butterfly can really rebound, as shown by 2020 here. I think we just lack a sufficient amount of knowledge to justify calling this species endangered at this time.
Yes, I totally agree with everything that Chip's just said, and would point out that when it was petitioned for listing 2014 by Lincoln Brower and Xerxes, that just created a huge interest and upswell of love for the monarch, for want of a better word. And the things we've done since that time, I think, are just on the verge of showing themselves. Some of the things that we're seeing in the population fluctuations may actually be, the upswing may actually be due to some of the things we've been doing now for almost a decade. So I think, the listing for endangered species listing has served its purpose. And if we go the full route, then all the problems that Chip's just spoken about will happen, and it could be a backlash and things could go the other way. So I fervently hope that it doesn't come to that and we just continue doing what we're doing, because I think it is working.
Since the question was a little bit about politics, I totally agree with what you just said, David, that the petition for listing brought the crises, brought the need to a wide attention, especially coming from scientists and an organization like Xerxes. And then we get into the era in which it was considered and the decision was precluded. And I don't know, were you all listening when the Fish and Wildlife Service opened it by saying that no one waited for a listing? And that's all of you. We all got busy in the many ways whether it was research, restoration, education, putting to work the things that we knew. We didn't wait, and that was really amazing. But I'm here to also tell you that your government did not wait. Last, was it May, June, that you went to Washington, Stu? And many, Chip, were you there in Washington? Many people, Hillary was in Washington, Lisa, did you go to Washington? Gail went to Washington. Okay, what I'm talking about is thanks to an Oregon politician, and thanks to the Secretary of Interior, Deb Haaland, a Native American, she convened leaders from all over the United States to help guide the government to coming up with a blueprint which now equals in the government bank being spent millions to help monarchs and by extension pollinators and insects. And already things are being set up. Am I right? Do you feel this way, Gail, Stu, Lisa, Hillary? And so it's true. No one wants regulation, but people do want the government to act, and it's starting to be felt. And that's the politics of it right now in 2023. So I just want to share kind of where these things go. It's kind of in funny directions sometimes, but right now the momentum behind helping monarchs and by extension all life is moving on there.
Wow. I agree with Chip, I agree with Myron, I agree with almost everything, and it's very difficult for me as a biologist to see the monarch butterfly as a species is threatened. But what I think is threatened goes way back. I think Broward actually posed that, is the winter irrigation. And that's really is the crux of everything. The winter irrigation is very delicate. It's, we worry about it. The monarch winter sites are slowly depleting. We can find new ones, but in order to have it to go from generation to generation, it has to be managed. And that is still a science that is in its infancy. We as scientists will describe things that perhaps in the future you could use those to manage a winter site. But as far as I'm concerned, it's the management of winter sites that is most important for this phenomenon that we really enjoy. As far as a species being threatened, I have problems.
Can I ask a question? What I've heard about the overwintering sites, and there's some great work there, is I think you're in a position to actually build new overwintering sites and actually test your hypotheses. And rather than, and I think it's good that you manage the existing ones. That's necessary, obviously. But from what you've described, I don't see why you don't start making new ones to see. There was a horrible film, and you'll know it. If you build it, they will come or something. But in this case, they might.
May I respond to that?
Yeah.
You're correct, we can, okay, we have to say, but there are places where development has occurred. And there are places where I was given a grove to manage for the butterflies, they were not there. Okay, so I went in there and modified the habitat, and they came. So what I'm trying to say is that you are correct, but still, growth as such is a living entity. It changes with time. And because it changes with time, you have to manage it. And basically what you try to do is to suppress succession for the butterflies. So that's my point.
Okay. It's interesting. It sounds like most people in this panel agree that the cons outweigh the pros of the listing, but the pros did I say that right? The cons outweigh the pros for listing the monarch, but the pros outweigh the cons for suggesting that it be listed, which is what Via suggested. So. Yeah. Let's see, let's stick with this business of the overwintering sites, and we'll start with you on this, Kingston. And this was one that a question that grew out of one that was in the box. Why are there such large differences between Mexico and the west coast of North America in the distribution, size, and geography of monarch overwintering sites? Now, I know there's probably not a clear answer to that, but if nothing else, you could talk about what we would need to do to see if we can answer that question.
I think, Myron, did you make, many years ago, you wrote something about it. I really don't know whether it was you or someone else. It's something about the amount of milkweeds found. And if you were to compare the amount of milkweeds found west of the Rocky Mountains, it's minimal compared to those found west of the Rocky Mountains.
Sure. About the milk, well, I don't know much about your milkweed in this part of the world. My plea earlier was you need to get a good handle on that biomass basically and map it. So it was not high. I did some temperature modeling.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
I think I remember there's something like
Yeah,
that.
yeah.
But anyway, I think the main problem the main reason why there's a difference is the amount of milkweeds found in the west of the Rocky Mountain and east of the Rocky Mountain. For example, when Karen Oberhaus came over and looked at the milkweeds, she was surprised to find more than 3 or 4 caterpillars on a single milkweed. Whereas in the, am I wrong, Chip, that you have so much milkweeds there that it's not uncommon to find one milkweed, one caterpillar per plant, or are they all clustered in one area? I don't know.
You're talking about the eastern population?
Eastern
Yeah,
population.
yeah.
You can spend hours and hours looking for eggs and larvae on eastern milkweeds. I mean, the density is really low. One of the interesting controversies, of course, is dealing with OE, the parasitic sort of contamination that occurs in these systems. And one of the problems with having low density milkweed populations is that OE is generally quite a bit higher because it's a frequency dependent system. If you have females landing on the same plants over and over and over again, sooner or later you're going to get spores on those plants, and sooner or later you're going to transmit OE. You have a lot of milkweeds, really a lot of milkweeds relative to the number of butterflies out there, and OE goes down. This is why I talked about being able to predict whether OE is going to be up or down on the basis of an assessment of what the summer population is going to be in the Midwest. So yeah, there's a lot of dynamics here that we need to understand in much greater detail. But I think that's one of the interesting differences between the East and West. I should comment on the fact that one of the things that I pointed out earlier is that you've got overwintering sites scattered over 500 miles in this state, which is remarkable because if you go to Mexico, the number of colonies, they're on 12 massives, which is a massive is a mountain range, and they're all within about 30 miles of latitude of each other. They're all at very, very close to 19.5 degrees north, with about 15 miles on either side of that. They're in a very narrow band. And your butterflies are not in a narrow band, and they're in a climate region which is almost identical across this narrow band. And so you're not dealing with that here. You're dealing with 5 southern counties in California, which are losing their butterflies. They're losing their overwintering sites. They're declining. I showed that when I was here in 2020. And they're declining because it's getting warmer in the south and the butterflies are moving north. So a larger proportion of the butterflies overwintering in California now are from overwintering sites that are in the northern counties relative to what it was 20 years ago. So things are changing here. It's a very dynamic relationship here. And they are changing a little bit in Mexico, just a little bit relative to the change that's going on here. So this is the thing that I'm really concerned about with respect to what's going on in this Western population. You're dealing with an entirely different dynamic in terms of the weather and the long-term aspects of the climate.
Again, the question here that I was trying to, is about how we got to this point of having these 2 very different sorts of aggregation structures. You know, in the East, piece, like,
Yes, come on,
Yeah.
folks, address the question.
yeah.
That's what he's trying to say.
And that was the question on the card. So it's,
I don't think we really know. I mean, the population size is obviously dependent on the number of milkweed, and it's been pointed out that our milkweed distribution is totally different from the east. It's far fewer milkweeds. There's huge areas of aridity. There's no milkweeds growing at all, and then when milkweeds do grow, there's a whole bunch in a relatively small area. So it's a totally different scheme for the butterfly to navigate and that's why we need to do research on that fundamental part of the life cycle too, just their breeding ecology. We can't, look at the eastern US papers on that because it's not really relevant to here. So that has to be fundamental to why our population is so much smaller and why the colonies are, in a long line instead of a congregation is simply due to the climate being the coastal climate, as Chip pointed out, is pretty much the same over 500 miles or whatever it is, which allows them to survive. So they've just decided to choose that area for overwintering because the conditions are suitable for a long distance instead of just one small spot on a mountainside. So it's just another example, I think, of how adaptable and intelligent they are.
So I'll beg to differ just a little bit. For the heck of it. I think it begs a number of other questions. So are there no other places in Mexico in these mountains where they could overwinter? And the same then in California? Is this the best of a bad lot they have to deal with? Or are there other places they could have been but are now not? And there are some inland overwintering sites, or were historically. I don't know if there still are. As things change there, and they're making do with what they've got available. There's nowhere else to go. I'm simply posing the question. And are there other sites we're not aware of in Mexico? Don't know. This is your patch.
JS.
One thing that we're discussing a lot right now among those that I work with in Marin is the shifting baseline theory and how many of us formed our view of monarch overwintering and migration based on what we've observed kind of in this group's lifetime, and because the record doesn't really go back that far in California. As Chip pointed out, there's probably been many variations in the population and the adaptations that this resilient insect has done since time immemorial. But one thing I just want to offer is that's kind of hopeful, besides the insect being so resilient, is that one of the things that really moved me when I was able to stand with people in Mexico is since time immemorial, the monarchs have been returning to Mexico, and a whole cosmology has developed, and others in this room should probably speak directly of that, but it really moved me about a whole life view of the returning of my ancestors and the connection to the cycles of nature, and only really knowing about the arrival and forming of the aggregations, not knowing what was happening up in the Kansas, etc. Anyway, so I'm just also saying that we may be going through another, we don't really have that in California, by the way. We don't really know what happened once upon a time. That's always a question I get. What happened before the eucalyptus was widespread? I'm very moved by Stu encouraging us to go to an ancestral spot where monarchs are overwintering in pine. I'm kind of rambling, but I'm just saying that this is, we don't really know what once was. We know what happened in our lifetimes. We also don't know what's ahead, and there is that hope or that offer that I'm up in the northern range that we may be a hope for the future. We haven't seen it yet. There isn't yet that uptick in population, but things are gonna change, and we have to be open to that, because we could restore more sites like has been challenged, and Kingston and Stu have demonstrated is possible. We may find new sites because private ownership is opening up access to see what's there. I'm rambling, but I'm just saying that we have a view, we don't really know what's ahead, we know it's resilient, and we have a profound connection.
Chip, did you have a follow-up?
Yeah, I think Myron's right. I think there probably are other sites in Mexico. When I first got involved with this, I proposed that to Lincoln, and he kind of laughed and smiled and was very tolerant with me for being so stupid, but,
You did the same thing.
but, you look at what's going on in Mexico, and you look at where they come, and where there are colonies in this narrow band, and then you look at the distribution of oil melt trees, and you look at the climates in various mountain ranges nearby, and it looks like there's a lot of places that monarchs could go, but they only go to this one narrow spot. And so the question is, why do they go to that one narrow spot? And so we heard this thing from Patrick Guerra yesterday, talking about how there is no magnetic map response to these butterflies when they get to those overwintering sites. But there is something that brings them there, that stops them migrating there. And what I've been able to determine with the help of David Chabot, a long-term partner long ago, is that when the difference between one day and the next day is less than a minute, the migration stops at that point. So part of what we're looking at or thinking about is an evolutionary adaptation to what is predominantly the celestial cycle. That may be what really defines where these butterflies are in Mexico.
That begs the question, why so many?
Yeah. Well, thanks. I think we're getting down to the wire here, right? So I'm going to ask one more question. That was one, again, right off of the cards, and I think it's kind of an interesting one to finish this discussion with. And again, we're running out of time, so if you keep your answers fairly brief. But what are your predictions for the future of monarchs? Will they go extinct? We know your answer to that one. Yeah. Will the migration continue? Will we see more breeding year-round? So if you could quickly, your sort of predictions for what the monarchs. You don't want to start with that?
So extinction, no. Unlikely in our lifetime. Migration, yes, it will continue, but it'll be interesting to see the changes. Population-wise, they'll bounce around. If you get more milkweed, and I think there's no way to use the expression, but yes, it's good you're increasing it, but to raise that bar even higher is going to take a lot more. But I think they'll just bounce around that level for a while. I think the populations out here are interesting as to their dynamic. I would still bring up, have a look at how much rescue occurs. And there's a question and Mika addressed this in a recent review and begged the question, left it a little bit open-ended. Genetically, the East and the West is the same. We cannot distinguish between them. They're identical. Whether they're expressing those genes the same way is a different matter. And so you need to start looking at that. It might start to address perhaps some of these subtle differences that you're seeing. And that would be a useful argument.
I think that the question has a near-term answer and a long-term answer. And the question is, what's the long-term answer? In the near term, maybe 10, 20, 30 years, this migration is going to continue. We have no idea what those parameters are for continuation. But in the long term, if you look at the long term of how this planet is changing, I wouldn't bet on monarchs being able to continue these migrations.
And on that note, really we can't see that far ahead, I don't think, and we can only look to 20 to 30 years perhaps, and I believe we're going to see a lot of volatility in the populations continue, as we've seen for the last few years, dependent upon climate, weather, as we've heard, particularly what the conditions are like at the end of the breeding season and the migratory period, as to whether they whether they overwinter in the traditional sites or form winter breeding populations, as I said in my talk, that will vary from year to year. I think, as I said earlier, the things that we are doing, if they're not already helping, they're going to be helping very soon. I think we're beginning to see that. So I think the future's for the Western Monarch is pretty good. It's volatile, but it's not, as you know from my talk, I believe in the adaptability and the resilience of the Monarch. It can cope with a lot. I mean, obviously, the more we can do to help it, the better. And reduce pesticide use is the top thing I think we should do if we can. And again, that's a transitional change that will take time. And we are doing that. So, in contrast to Chip, I think it's probably a better long-term outlook if we could see that far ahead. But in the short term, volatile. But if we keep doing what we're doing, I think they'll get through.
After seeing Lisa and Felina here, aren't you encouraged? And I look at who is out there working. I see Jessica in front of me. I work with Emma, Isis, Ashley, Serena, and Xerxes. I look at the staff that Monarch Joint Venture has out here. I see the experts' work being put into practice. How can you not be hopeful when you see this youthful crowd moving up to make good science and make good decisions? So let's watch what happens.
I tend to be optimistic. I think what is started now will continue, and what we learn will actually build upon. And I think the future is actually bright. That's how I feel.
I think we're gonna have to, we'll close on that note. Yeah, so as I said, we're expecting to post the questions and with answers on the website or someplace. We'll figure out how to get that distributed. So this has been a wonderful exchange of thoughts and ideas, and please join me in thanking the panel for Is there, where's Rob?